Imagine standing in Europe during the late summer of 1939. The streets were busy. Factories were working day and night. Trains crossed borders carrying passengers, supplies, and soldiers. To many ordinary people, life continued almost as normal. Yet beneath that appearance of calm, governments across Europe sensed that something enormous was approaching. Only 20 years had passed since the end of the First World War, a conflict so destructive that many believed humanity would never repeat such a tragedy. Millions had died, entire cities had been devastated, and the political map of Europe had been redrawn. Germany had suffered perhaps the deepest humiliation of all. The Treaty of Versailles imposed severe military restrictions, territorial losses, and heavy financial obligations. Many Germans believed the treaty punished not only their government but an entire nation. Economic hardship followed. Hyperinflation wiped out personal savings. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment reached alarming levels. Families struggled simply to buy bread. In this atmosphere of frustration and uncertainty, radical political movements gained support. One of those movements was led by Adolf Hitler. A gifted speaker with an extraordinary ability to attract attention, Hitler promised something many Germans desperately wanted to hear. He promised national renewal. He claimed Germany would become strong again. He promised jobs. He promised pride. Most importantly, he promised to overturn the post-war order that many Germans viewed as unfair. When Hitler became chancellor in 1933, relatively few people imagined how dramatically Europe would change over the next decade. His government immediately began rebuilding Germany's armed forces. New factories produced aircraft, tanks, artillery, and military vehicles. Young men entered military service in growing numbers. Road networks expanded rapidly, allowing troops and equipment to move faster across the country. Military parades became symbols of national strength. To supporters, Germany appeared to be recovering. To neighboring countries, however, these developments caused increasing concern. Hitler also relied heavily on propaganda. Large public rallies filled stadiums with thousands of supporters carrying flags and listening to carefully prepared speeches. Radio broadcasts spread government messages into millions of homes. Newspapers emphasized national unity and military success. The image presented to the public was one of confidence, discipline, and unstoppable momentum. Meanwhile, Germany began challenging the international agreements created after the First World War. In 1936, German forces entered the Rhineland, a region that had previously been restricted by treaty. Many foreign governments protested. But no military action followed. Hitler concluded that his opponents were reluctant to confront him directly. 2 years later came another major step. Austria became part of Germany in an event known as the Anschluss. Again, international opposition remained limited. Soon afterward, attention shifted toward Czechoslovakia. Diplomatic negotiations attempted to prevent another crisis. Some European leaders hoped that satisfying Germany's territorial demands would preserve peace. History would later remember this strategy as appeasement. For a short time, it seemed successful. No major war followed immediately. Yet each peaceful agreement strengthened Hitler's confidence. Each diplomatic victory convinced him that the Western powers lacked both unity and determination. By 1939, Germany possessed one of Europe's most modern armed forces. Its military emphasized speed, coordination, and surprise. Tanks advanced alongside infantry. Aircraft supported ground attacks. Radio communication allowed commanders to react faster than many of their opponents. Military planners believed future wars would be won not through long years of trench warfare, but through rapid offensives that overwhelmed defenders before they could organize. Still, one major obstacle remained. A large conflict involving both Western Europe and the Soviet Union would stretch German resources beyond their limits. Avoiding a two-front war became an important strategic objective. Diplomatic negotiations continued behind closed doors. Across Europe, diplomats exchanged proposals while intelligence officers gathered information and military commanders prepared contingency plans. Most citizens knew very little about these secret discussions. They simply hoped peace would continue. But history was already moving toward a different outcome. Within only a few weeks, decisions made in government offices would send millions of soldiers across international borders. The Second World War was no longer a distant possibility. It was becoming inevitable. And although Adolf Hitler believed he had carefully prepared Germany for victory, the choices he made before the first shots were fired would shape everything that followed. Some of those decisions brought spectacular early success. Others planted the seeds of ultimate defeat. The road to war was complete. The next chapter would reveal how Germany shocked the world with a new style of warfare. One that changed military history almost overnight. By the early morning of September 1, 1939, Europe awoke to the sound many had feared but hoped would never come. German forces crossed the Polish border from several directions at once. Columns of tanks rolled across open fields. Motorized infantry advanced behind them. Above, formations of aircraft filled the sky. The invasion marked the beginning of the Second World War. Unlike the trench warfare that had defined the First World War, Germany relied on a new style of military strategy. It became known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of slowly wearing down an enemy over months or years, German commanders aimed to strike with overwhelming speed. Aircraft attacked communication centers, railways, and airfields. Artillery opened gaps in defensive lines. Tank divisions rushed through those openings before defenders could reorganize. Infantry followed to secure captured territory. The entire operation depended on coordination. Radio communication allowed commanders to adjust movements almost instantly. This gave German forces a significant advantage over armies that still relied on slower methods of communication. Within weeks, Polish resistance became increasingly difficult. The country faced pressure from multiple directions. Its military fought bravely, but the speed of the German advance made organized defense extremely challenging. As fighting continued, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Their declarations transformed a regional conflict into a continental one. Yet despite entering the war, neither country immediately launched a major offensive in Western Europe. For several months, the Western Front remained unusually quiet. Historians later referred to this period as the Phony War. Behind that temporary silence, however, Germany continued preparing for its next campaigns. Hitler believed rapid victories would discourage prolonged resistance. His attention soon turned north. In April 1940, German forces launched operations against Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrendered within a single day. Norway resisted longer, supported by British and French forces. The campaign proved more difficult than expected, but Germany eventually secured control of the country. The occupation gave Germany access to important ports and protected vital supply routes connected to Swedish iron ore, an essential resource for German industry. Only weeks later, another major offensive began. This time, the targets were Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. Many Allied commanders expected Germany to repeat the strategy used during the First World War by attacking directly through Belgium. German planners anticipated this expectation. Instead of relying solely on traditional routes, they sent powerful armored divisions through the Ardennes forest. Many military experts considered the dense forest unsuitable for large armored formations. German commanders viewed it as an opportunity. The gamble succeeded. German tanks emerged where Allied forces least expected them. Within days, defensive plans unraveled. Communication became increasingly difficult. Entire units found themselves surrounded before they fully understood the scale of the breakthrough. The speed of the German advance shocked military observers around the world. One by one, towns and cities fell. Belgium surrendered. The Netherlands surrendered. French defensive positions became increasingly isolated. Thousands of Allied soldiers retreated toward the French coast. At the port of Dunkirk, one of the most remarkable rescue operations in military history unfolded. military vessels, fishing boats, ferries, and hundreds of civilian boats crossed the English Channel to evacuate trapped British and Allied troops. More than 330,000 soldiers escaped to Britain. Although much of their heavy equipment was abandoned, the evacuation preserved experienced troops who would later return to fight. Meanwhile, German forces continued advancing toward Paris. On June 14, 1940, German troops entered the French capital. Only days later, France requested an armistice. The campaign had lasted little more than 6 weeks. For many observers, the result seemed almost unbelievable. One of Europe's largest military powers had fallen with astonishing speed. Hitler appeared unstoppable. Across occupied Europe, German victories created an image of military invincibility. Newspapers around the world analyzed the effectiveness of blitzkrieg. Military academies studied German tactics. Some governments feared that Britain might become the next country to fall. Inside Germany, celebrations filled the streets. Victory parades marched through major cities. Propaganda presented Hitler as a brilliant military leader whose decisions could not fail. Yet beneath the celebrations, important warning signs already existed. Germany's victories depended heavily on rapid movement, reliable fuel supplies, and constant coordination between different branches of the military. A longer conflict against powerful industrial nations would place enormous pressure on those resources. Some senior officers quietly recognized this challenge. But after so many dramatic successes, few people wanted to question the momentum. Confidence gradually became overconfidence. And overconfidence often leads leaders to believe they cannot make mistakes. For Adolf Hitler, that dangerous belief was beginning to take hold. The campaigns in Poland, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France transformed Germany into the dominant military power in continental Europe. Only one major opponent remained unconquered in the West. Across the English Channel, Britain refused to surrender. Its government rejected negotiations. Its people prepared for invasion. And its air force stood ready for a battle that would decide the future of Europe. The next phase of the war would not be fought mainly on land. It would unfold high above cities, coastlines, and open seas. For the first time since the war began, Hitler would encounter an enemy that refused to collapse under pressure. And the outcome would become one of the most important turning points of the entire conflict. By the summer of 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at the height of his power. In less than a year, Germany had defeated Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. Across Europe, many believed no army could stop the German war machine. Only one major nation still stood against Nazi Germany: Great Britain. Separated from mainland Europe by the English Channel, Britain remained unconquered. Hitler initially hoped that Britain would negotiate a peace agreement. He believed that after the rapid collapse of France, the British government might decide that continuing the war was hopeless. But Britain had a new Prime Minister: Winston Churchill. Unlike many political leaders before him, Churchill refused to consider surrender. Instead, he promised that Britain would continue fighting no matter how difficult the situation became. In speeches broadcast across the country, he encouraged the British people to remain determined. His message was simple. The war was far from over. If Germany wanted to invade Britain, it first had to gain control of the skies. German military planners developed Operation Sea Lion, a proposed invasion of southern England. However, such an operation could only succeed if the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, defeated the Royal Air Force, known as the RAF. Thus began one of the most important air campaigns in history: the Battle of Britain. Unlike earlier campaigns fought mainly by tanks and infantry, the struggle unfolded almost entirely in the air. Every day, formations of German bombers crossed the English Channel. Fighter aircraft escorted them toward military targets across southern England. Their first objectives were radar stations, airfields, aircraft factories, and communication centers. Germany hoped to destroy Britain's ability to defend its own skies. The RAF faced enormous pressure. British pilots often flew several missions each day. Many were exhausted. Some had only recently completed training. Yet they possessed several important advantages. Britain had developed an advanced radar network capable of detecting incoming aircraft long before they reached the coast. This early warning system allowed fighter squadrons to intercept German attacks with remarkable efficiency. Radar became one of Britain's greatest strategic strengths. Every minute of warning gave pilots precious time to prepare. The fighting quickly became intense. High above the countryside, aircraft engaged in fast-moving dogfights. Pilots depended on skill, speed, and split-second decisions. Many never returned from their missions. Both sides suffered heavy losses. As weeks passed, Germany expected British resistance to weaken. Instead, the RAF continued flying. Aircraft damaged in combat were repaired quickly. New pilots joined the fight. Factories increased production. Despite relentless attacks, Britain's air defenses remained operational. Frustrated by the lack of decisive results, Hitler approved a change in strategy. German bombers shifted their attention from military installations to British cities. London became the primary target. Night after night, bombers crossed the Channel carrying explosive and incendiary bombs. The campaign became known simply as the Blitz. Homes, factories, railway stations, and historic buildings were damaged or destroyed. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath smoke and fire. Yet something unexpected happened. Rather than breaking civilian morale, the bombing strengthened public determination. Families sheltered together in underground stations. Emergency workers rescued survivors from damaged buildings. Firefighters battled enormous blazes throughout the night. Each morning, people returned to work despite the destruction surrounding them. The government encouraged resilience. Posters reminded citizens to remain calm. Communities supported one another. Across Britain, ordinary people became part of the nation's defense. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe continued suffering significant losses. German bombers required fighter protection. Long flights over the Channel limited the time German fighters could remain over Britain before fuel shortages forced them to return. British aircraft, operating close to home, enjoyed a major advantage. Pilots who parachuted from damaged planes often returned to duty within days. German pilots shot down over Britain usually became prisoners of war. As autumn approached, it became increasingly clear that Germany had failed to destroy the Royal Air Force. Without air superiority, Operation Sea Lion became far too risky. The planned invasion was postponed indefinitely. Eventually, it was abandoned altogether. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Hitler had failed to achieve one of his major strategic objectives. The consequences reached far beyond Britain. Around the world, governments noticed that Nazi Germany was not invincible. The myth of unstoppable German victory had been challenged. Britain remained in the war. Its islands would later serve as the launching point for Allied operations that eventually returned to mainland Europe. Looking back, many historians consider the Battle of Britain one of the most significant turning points of the Second World War. Had Germany gained control of British skies, the future of Europe might have unfolded very differently. Instead, Hitler chose another path. Unable to force Britain out of the war, he turned his attention eastward. There lay an enormous country rich in land, oil, grain, and resources. It was also governed by a man Hitler deeply distrusted: Joseph Stalin. Ignoring warnings from several of his own commanders, Hitler prepared the largest land invasion ever attempted in human history. It would be called Operation Barbarossa. At first, it appeared destined for another spectacular German victory. But beneath those early successes waited the beginning of the Third Reich's greatest disaster. By the end of 1940, Adolf Hitler controlled more of Europe than any German leader in modern history. France had fallen. Much of Western Europe was under German occupation. Although Britain continued to resist, Hitler believed it no longer posed the greatest threat to his ambitions. His attention shifted east. For years, Hitler had spoken about expanding Germany's territory into Eastern Europe. He believed that vast lands to the east could provide farmland, raw materials, and resources to sustain a powerful empire. The Soviet Union stood directly in the way of that vision. Despite the non-aggression pact signed in 1939, Hitler never intended for the agreement to last forever. He viewed it as a temporary arrangement. Now, convinced that Germany was stronger than ever, he believed the time had come to destroy the Soviet Union before it could become an even greater military power. Many of his generals expressed concerns. The Soviet Union was enormous. Its population was vast. Its industries were growing. And its territory stretched thousands of miles beyond the borders of Europe. Some officers warned that invading such a large country would require enormous resources and careful planning. Hitler dismissed many of those concerns. He believed the campaign would end quickly. German intelligence also underestimated Soviet military strength. Reports suggested that the Red Army had been weakened by years of political purges and poor leadership. German planners expected victory within a few months. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. It became the largest land invasion in human history. More than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed the Soviet border. Thousands of tanks rolled forward. Aircraft filled the skies. Artillery opened fire across a front stretching nearly 1,800 miles. The scale of the operation was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The invasion was divided into 3 main directions. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad. Army Group Center pushed toward Moscow. Army Group South headed into Ukraine, seeking valuable farmland and industrial regions. During the first weeks, German forces achieved astonishing success. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were captured. Large quantities of military equipment were destroyed or abandoned. Many observers believed the Soviet Union might collapse before winter. But beneath these victories, serious problems were already beginning to emerge. The farther German troops advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts had to travel hundreds of miles over damaged roads. Many Soviet railways used different track gauges, making transportation slower and more complicated. As the retreating Soviet forces withdrew, they implemented a scorched earth strategy. Bridges were destroyed. Railroads were damaged. Food supplies were burned. Factories were dismantled or moved far to the east. The advancing German army often found empty towns instead of valuable resources. Every mile gained required more trucks, more fuel, and more manpower. Then another challenge appeared. Distance. Maps could not fully prepare commanders for the vastness of the Soviet Union. What seemed like a short advance often became weeks of exhausting movement. Vehicles broke down. Engines wore out. Supplies arrived late. Meanwhile, Soviet resistance grew stronger. Although the Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses, new divisions continued to appear. Factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains continued producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery far from German bombers. The Soviet government urged its people to defend their homeland at any cost. Millions answered the call. As autumn arrived, heavy rains transformed roads into thick mud. Military vehicles struggled to move. Supply convoys became trapped. The rapid speed that had made Blitzkrieg so successful slowed dramatically. Then came winter. German commanders had expected the campaign to end long before freezing temperatures arrived. Many soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Weapons malfunctioned in the extreme cold. Vehicle engines refused to start. Frostbite became almost as dangerous as enemy fire. Temperatures fell far below freezing. At the same time, Soviet forces launched powerful counterattacks. Fresh troops from Siberia, trained for winter warfare, entered the battlefield. Near Moscow, German advances finally stopped. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the German army was forced into large-scale retreat. The dream of a quick victory had vanished. Oh! Operation Barbarossa had failed to achieve its most important objective. The Soviet Union remained in the war. Instead of ending the conflict, Germany now faced exactly what Hitler had hoped to avoid from the beginning: a long and exhausting war on two major fronts. In the West, Britain continued resisting. In the East, the Soviet Union was recovering. Germany's resources would now be divided between two enormous battlefields. Many historians consider this one of Hitler's greatest strategic mistakes. His confidence had led him to underestimate both the size of the Soviet Union and the determination of its people. The rapid victories of earlier campaigns created an illusion that every opponent would collapse just as quickly. History proved otherwise. As 1942 began, Hitler refused to accept that his strategy needed to change. Rather than strengthening his defenses, he demanded another massive offensive. His new objective lay far to the south. A city on the banks of the Volga River. A city that carried the name of the Soviet leader himself. Stalingrad. Hitler believed capturing it would break Soviet morale and secure valuable oil supplies for Germany. Instead, it would become the battlefield that changed the course of the entire Second World War. By the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler faced a difficult reality. The quick victory he had expected in the Soviet Union had not happened. German forces still occupied vast territories, but the Red Army refused to collapse. Instead of ending the war, Germany found itself locked in a long and exhausting campaign. Despite this, Hitler remained convinced that one decisive victory could restore Germany's momentum. His attention turned south. The region contained something Germany desperately needed: oil. Modern armies depended on fuel. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and warships could not operate without it. Germany's own oil reserves were limited, and the war was consuming enormous quantities every day. Hitler believed that capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus would solve this problem. Along the route stood one important city: Stalingrad. Situated on the western bank of the Volga River, it served as a major industrial center and transportation hub. Factories there produced military equipment, and the river carried vital supplies deep into Soviet territory. Its name also carried symbolic importance. Because it was named after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, Hitler believed its capture would deal a devastating psychological blow. In August 1942, German bombers launched massive air raids against the city. Thousands of buildings were destroyed. Smoke covered the skyline. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath rubble. German commanders expected the defenders to surrender after such destruction. Instead, the ruins became their greatest obstacle. Collapsed buildings, shattered factories, and broken streets created a battlefield unlike any the German army had previously encountered. Large tank formations could no longer move freely. Every block became a fortress. Every basement became a defensive position. Every staircase could hide enemy soldiers. The fighting became incredibly close. Sometimes opposing forces occupied different floors of the same building. Control of a single house could change hands several times in one day. Soviet soldiers adopted a simple strategy: stay close to the enemy. By fighting at extremely short distances, they reduced the effectiveness of German artillery and air support. The battle became one of endurance rather than speed. German soldiers nicknamed it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, because both sides fought through ruined buildings, tunnels, and collapsed cellars. Meanwhile, outside the city, Soviet commanders prepared a much larger plan. Rather than attacking directly inside Stalingrad, they studied the German positions surrounding it. They noticed a critical weakness. The flanks protecting the city were held not only by German troops but also by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units. Many of these formations had fewer tanks, less artillery, and limited anti-tank weapons. The Soviets decided to strike there instead. In November 1942, they launched Operation Uranus. Massive Soviet armies attacked from the north and south simultaneously. Snowstorms covered the battlefield as thousands of tanks and artillery pieces advanced. Within days, the two attacking forces met behind the German Sixth Army. More than 250,000 German and Axis soldiers suddenly found themselves surrounded. The city that Hitler had hoped to capture had become a trap. Several German generals requested permission to break out while escape was still possible. They argued that remaining inside the pocket would lead to disaster. Hitler refused. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold its position. He believed supplies could be delivered by air until relief forces arrived. But reality proved very different. The German Air Force simply lacked enough transport aircraft. Bad weather, Soviet anti-aircraft fire, and long distances made regular deliveries impossible. Food became scarce. Fuel almost disappeared. Medical supplies ran out. As winter tightened its grip, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Many soldiers suffered from frostbite, illness, and exhaustion. Horses that had once pulled artillery were slaughtered for food. Vehicles stood motionless without fuel. Inside the ruined city, survival became the daily objective. Outside, Soviet forces strengthened their encirclement. Christmas arrived in 1942. For thousands of German soldiers, it was spent inside frozen ruins far from home. Some still believed reinforcements would arrive. Others quietly understood that rescue was becoming impossible. In January 1943, Soviet troops launched their final offensive against the trapped defenders. German resistance weakened steadily. Buildings that had once served as strongholds fell one after another. Finally, on February 2, 1943, the remaining German forces surrendered. It was one of the greatest defeats in German military history. An entire field army had been destroyed. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed. Many others entered captivity. Only a small number would ever return home after the war. The impact reached far beyond the battlefield. For the first time, people across occupied Europe saw that Germany could suffer a catastrophic defeat. The myth of Nazi invincibility had been shattered. Soviet morale soared. Allied leaders gained renewed confidence. German commanders began questioning decisions made at the highest level. Yet Hitler refused to admit failure. Instead of changing his strategy, he demanded continued resistance across every front. The war that Germany once hoped to win quickly had become a struggle of resources, production, and endurance. In those areas, the Allies were growing stronger every month. American factories produced enormous quantities of aircraft, tanks, and trucks. British bombers intensified attacks on German industry. The Soviet Union continued rebuilding its armies at astonishing speed. Germany now faced three powerful enemies whose combined industrial strength far exceeded its own. The balance of the war had begun to shift. From this point forward, Germany would increasingly fight to defend territory rather than conquer it. And while fierce battles still lay ahead, many historians regard Stalingrad as the moment when Hitler's dream of dominating Europe began to collapse. The road to Berlin had not yet begun. But the road to defeat certainly had. The surrender at Stalingrad marked far more than the loss of a single German army. It marked the beginning of a new phase of the war. For nearly 4 years, Germany had expanded across Europe with astonishing speed. One nation after another had fallen beneath the pressure of blitzkrieg. But by early 1943, the momentum had changed. The Allies were no longer fighting simply to survive. They were preparing to push Germany back. The first signs of this shift appeared far from the battlefields of Eastern Europe. Across the deserts of North Africa, German and Italian forces had fought British and Commonwealth troops for control of vital shipping routes and access to the Mediterranean. One of Germany's most respected commanders, Field Marshal Owen Rommel, earned the nickname the Desert Fox because of his bold tactics and ability to surprise his opponents. For a time, his forces achieved remarkable success. But victories alone could not solve Germany's growing logistical problems. Every tank required fuel. Every truck needed spare parts. Every soldier depended on food, water, and ammunition. As Allied naval and air power increased, supplying German forces across the Mediterranean became increasingly difficult. Convoys carrying fuel and equipment were frequently attacked before reaching their destinations. By late 1942, the balance had begun to shift. British forces won an important victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in Egypt. Soon afterward, American and British troops landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch. Germany suddenly faced Allied armies advancing from both east and west across North Africa. Despite determined resistance, Axis forces could no longer hold their positions. In May 1943, nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. The campaign ended with an Allied victory. For the first time, the Western Allies had completely defeated a major German army on land. Their next objective lay across the Mediterranean. Italy. In July 1943, Allied troops landed on the island of Sicily. The invasion exposed serious weaknesses within Italy's government. Public confidence collapsed. Soon afterward, Benito Mussolini, Hitler's longtime ally and the leader of Fascist Italy, was removed from power by his own government. Italy later signed an armistice with the Allies. Germany responded quickly. German troops occupied much of northern and central Italy, determined to prevent Allied forces from advancing deeper into Europe. The Italian campaign became long and difficult. Mountainous terrain favored defenders. Heavy rain and harsh weather slowed every advance. Although progress was measured in miles rather than hundreds of miles, Germany was forced to commit valuable troops and equipment to yet another front. Meanwhile, another battle unfolded high above Germany. Unlike earlier campaigns fought with tanks and infantry, this one involved hundreds of bombers crossing the skies. By day, American aircraft targeted factories, rail yards, bridges, and oil facilities. By night, British bombers attacked industrial centers and transportation networks. The goal was not only to damage military production but also to weaken Germany's ability to continue the war. Repair crews worked constantly. Factories moved underground whenever possible. Yet the pressure continued to grow. Aircraft production became more difficult. Fuel shortages worsened. Railroads required endless repairs. German cities suffered enormous destruction. At the same time, the Soviet Union continued pushing westward. After victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, the Red Army steadily forced German troops to retreat across Eastern Europe. Every month, Germany lost more experienced soldiers than it could replace. Young recruits entered combat with limited training. Equipment became harder to manufacture. Fuel grew increasingly scarce. Hitler, however, refused to consider withdrawal from many positions. Instead, he issued repeated orders demanding that every inch of ground be defended. Many generals believed these instructions sacrificed entire armies that might otherwise have escaped to stronger defensive positions. The greatest challenge still awaited Germany. For months, Allied planners secretly prepared an enormous invasion of Western Europe. Thousands of ships gathered in British ports. Millions of tons of supplies were assembled. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers trained for the operation. The invasion required complete secrecy. To confuse German intelligence, the Allies launched one of history's most successful deception campaigns. Fake tanks. Wooden aircraft. False radio transmissions. Even imaginary military units convinced German commanders that the invasion would occur elsewhere. Then, before dawn on June 6, 1944, the operation finally began. D-Day. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel toward the beaches of Normandy. Warships bombarded German coastal defenses. Paratroopers landed behind enemy lines. Engineers cleared obstacles under heavy fire. The landings were costly. Many soldiers never made it beyond the beaches. But by the end of the day, the Allies had established a foothold in France. Germany now faced powerful enemies advancing from opposite directions. The Soviet Union pressed forward from the east. The Western Allies advanced from the west. The Third Reich was caught in a tightening vice. During the following weeks, Allied forces slowly expanded their position in Normandy. In August 1944, Paris was liberated after 4 years of German occupation. Crowds filled the streets celebrating the return of freedom. Across Europe, resistance movements became increasingly active. Railways were sabotaged. Communication lines were disrupted. German supply routes became even more difficult to maintain. By the end of 1944, Hitler's empire was shrinking on every front. The strategy that had once brought rapid victories now offered no easy escape. Germany no longer possessed the resources to fight a prolonged war against 3 industrial superpowers. Factories struggled to replace lost equipment. Fuel reserves approached critical levels. Experienced commanders were becoming increasingly scarce. Yet Hitler still believed that one final offensive could reverse Germany's fortunes. Against the advice of many senior officers, he prepared a desperate counterattack in the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Germany's last major gamble. And when it failed, the road to Berlin would lie open. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich stood on the edge of collapse. Germany was fighting on every major front. In the east, the Red Army continued its relentless advance toward Berlin. In the west, British, American, Canadian, and other Allied forces had liberated much of France and were steadily moving toward Germany's borders. The skies above German cities were no longer safe. Bombers appeared almost daily. Factories struggled to keep production running. Railroads lay in ruins. Fuel had become one of Germany's greatest shortages. Yet Adolf Hitler refused to believe the war was lost. Instead of preparing for peace, he searched for one final victory. He believed that if Germany could split the Allied armies in Western Europe, political disagreements might force Britain and the United States to negotiate. His plan became known as the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, under the cover of dense fog and heavy snow, German troops launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. It was the same region where Germany had achieved spectacular success in 1940. Once again, tanks rolled through narrow roads surrounded by forests. At first, the attack shocked the Allies. Several American units were forced to retreat. The German advance created a large bulge in the Allied front line, giving the battle its famous name. For a brief moment, Hitler believed history might repeat itself. But the situation was very different from 1940. Germany no longer possessed unlimited fuel, experienced reserves, or air superiority. Every mile of advance consumed precious resources that could not easily be replaced. As the weather improved, Allied aircraft returned to the skies. They attacked German tanks, trucks, bridges, and supply columns. Fuel shortages became critical. Some German vehicles had to be abandoned simply because there was no gasoline left. The offensive gradually lost momentum. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had ended in failure. Germany had suffered enormous losses without changing the outcome of the war. It was Hitler's final major offensive. From that point onward, the German army fought almost entirely on the defensive. Meanwhile, events in the East unfolded even more dramatically. The Soviet Union launched massive offensives involving millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and overwhelming artillery support. One city after another was recaptured. Poland was liberated from German occupation. Soviet forces crossed the Oder River, placing them within striking distance of Berlin itself. Across Germany, millions of civilians fled westward. Roads filled with refugees carrying whatever belongings they could transport. Families became separated. Entire communities disappeared as the front lines moved closer. Inside Berlin, life became increasingly desperate. Government offices continued issuing orders. Propaganda broadcasts promised victory. But reality could no longer be hidden. Food was scarce. Electricity frequently failed. Buildings damaged by bombing stood abandoned across the city. Despite the worsening situation, Hitler refused to leave the capital. Instead, he moved into the Führerbunker, an underground command bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Protected by thick layers of reinforced concrete, the bunker became the final headquarters of the Nazi leadership. From there, Hitler continued receiving military reports. Large maps covered the walls. Officers moved markers representing divisions that often no longer existed. Many reports reaching the bunker painted an unrealistic picture. Some commanders feared delivering bad news. Others simply hoped for a miracle. Hitler increasingly ordered armies to launch counterattacks that were no longer possible. Entire divisions existed only on paper. Fuel shortages prevented tanks from moving. Communication with many frontline units had already collapsed. Still, Hitler refused to accept military reality. As Soviet artillery began striking Berlin in April 1945, fierce fighting erupted throughout the city. German soldiers, police units, and even teenage members of the Hitler Youth defended streets, bridges, and government buildings. The Soviet army advanced block by block through intense urban combat. Explosions echoed day and night. Smoke covered the skyline. Historic buildings were reduced to ruins. Civilians sought shelter in basements and subway tunnels, hoping simply to survive. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere grew increasingly hopeless. Trusted advisors disappeared. Some fled the city. Others surrendered to advancing Allied forces. News arrived that Benito Mussolini, Hitler's longtime ally, had been captured and killed in Italy. The collapse of Nazi Germany now appeared inevitable. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler died inside the Führer bunker. The following day, Soviet forces continued their advance toward the center of Berlin. Without effective leadership, organized German resistance rapidly collapsed. On May 2, 1945, Berlin officially surrendered. Only a few days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. Across Europe, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered in city squares. Flags filled the streets. For millions of people, the war in Europe had finally come to an end. Yet the cost was almost beyond imagination. Entire cities had been destroyed. Millions of civilians had lost their homes. Tens of millions of soldiers and civilians had died during 6 years of global conflict. The Third Reich, which Hitler believed would last for generations, had survived only 12 years. Its rapid rise had amazed the world. Its dramatic collapse became one of history's greatest warnings about dictatorship, unchecked ambition, and catastrophic miscalculation. But one final question remains. How did a leader who once controlled most of Europe lose everything? Was it a single mistake? Or a series of decisions that slowly destroyed the empire he had built? In our final chapter, we will examine the key reasons behind Hitler's defeat and the lasting lessons the Second World War left for the modern world. As the guns fell silent across Europe in May 1945, millions of people looked at the shattered cities around them and asked one question. How had Adolf Hitler, the man who once dominated nearly all of continental Europe, lost everything? Just 5 years earlier, Germany appeared almost unstoppable. Its armies moved faster than any military force the world had seen. Its victories shocked experienced generals. Its enemies struggled to respond. Yet in the end, the Third Reich collapsed completely. The answer was not a single battle. Nor was it one disastrous decision. Germany's defeat resulted from a combination of strategic mistakes, economic limitations, military overconfidence, and the growing strength of its opponents. One of Hitler's greatest errors was opening a war on too many fronts. Military history had repeatedly shown the dangers of fighting multiple powerful enemies at the same time. Yet Germany found itself battling Britain in the West, the Soviet Union in the East, and later the United States across Europe and the Atlantic. Each front demanded soldiers, weapons, fuel, aircraft, and supplies. No nation, regardless of its early victories, possessed unlimited resources. Every new battlefield stretched Germany's logistics further. Every offensive required more fuel. Every defensive line required more troops. Eventually, the demands became impossible to meet. Another major mistake was underestimating the Soviet Union. When Operation Barbarossa began in 1941, Hitler believed the campaign would end within months. Instead, the Soviet Union continued fighting despite enormous losses. Factories were relocated east of the Ural Mountains. New armies were formed. Industrial production expanded dramatically. The Red Army learned from earlier defeats and gradually improved its leadership, tactics, and coordination. By 1943, Soviet forces were launching powerful offensives instead of merely defending. The war that Germany expected to win quickly became a long conflict of endurance. Time no longer favored Hitler. Economic power also played a decisive role. Germany possessed advanced technology and highly trained soldiers, but its industrial capacity could not match the combined production of the Allied nations. The United States transformed its economy into what historians often describe as the arsenal of democracy. American factories produced thousands of aircraft, tanks, trucks, ships, and weapons every month. Britain continued manufacturing despite years of bombing. The Soviet Union expanded military production while relocating industries beyond German reach. Together, the Allies could replace equipment faster than Germany could destroy it. By contrast, Germany struggled with growing shortages. Fuel became increasingly scarce. Raw materials became harder to obtain. Factories suffered repeated bombing. Transportation networks faced constant disruption. Even when new weapons were produced, delivering them to the battlefield became increasingly difficult. Leadership decisions also shaped the outcome. Many German military commanders possessed considerable experience. Several recommended strategic withdrawals when situations became hopeless. Others advised concentrating forces instead of defending every position. Hitler increasingly rejected such advice. He often insisted that armies hold ground regardless of the military situation. These decisions sometimes trapped entire formations that might otherwise have escaped. As the war continued, Hitler assumed greater personal control over military operations. Professional commanders found themselves with less freedom to adapt. On many occasions, battlefield realities changed far more quickly than decisions made hundreds of miles away. By the final years of the war, Germany faced another growing challenge. Its experienced soldiers were becoming increasingly difficult to replace. Many veterans had been killed or wounded after years of continuous fighting. New recruits often entered combat with far less training than those who had fought during the early campaigns. At the same time, Allied forces continued improving through experience, cooperation, and overwhelming industrial support. The balance shifted steadily against Germany. Technology also evolved throughout the conflict. Radar improved air defense. Long-range bombers expanded strategic bombing campaigns. Code breaking and intelligence provided valuable information. Advances in logistics, communications, and manufacturing all influenced military success. Victory depended not only on courage in battle but also on science, engineering, transportation, and economic organization. Perhaps the greatest lesson concerns the danger of unchecked ambition. Early victories convinced Hitler that his judgment was superior to everyone else's. Success created confidence. Confidence became overconfidence. Overconfidence encouraged increasingly risky decisions. Instead of adjusting strategy after setbacks, he demanded even larger offensives. Each failure weakened Germany further. Each gamble left fewer resources for the next battle. By 1945, the consequences had become impossible to reverse. The Second World War became the deadliest conflict in human history. Military personnel and civilians alike suffered unimaginable losses. Entire communities disappeared. Historic cities were reduced to rubble. Families across continents carried the memory of the war for generations. After Germany's surrender, Europe faced the enormous task of rebuilding. Homes, railways, factories, schools, and governments all required reconstruction. International leaders also sought new ways to prevent another global catastrophe. New alliances emerged. International institutions expanded. The lessons of the war influenced diplomacy, military planning, and global politics for decades. Today, historians continue studying the Second World War not only to understand how it happened but also to understand how similar tragedies might be prevented in the future. History reminds us that military power alone cannot guarantee lasting success. Leadership requires sound judgment. Economic strength matters as much as battlefield victories. Alliances can change the balance of power. And decisions made by a small number of individuals can affect millions of lives. The story of Adolf Hitler is therefore not simply the story of one man. It is the story of how ambition without restraint, ideology without compassion, and power without accountability can lead nations toward catastrophe. The rise of Nazi Germany changed the world. Its fall changed it again. And the lessons left behind remain as important today as they were in 1945. Thank you for joining this journey through one of history's most significant chapters. If you enjoy thoughtful historical documentaries, stories of world history, and carefully researched narratives, consider following for more explorations of the past. Because history is not only about remembering what happened. It is about understanding why it happened and what future generations can learn from it. The end.